Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. I think we're going to have a few more participants trickle in, but welcome to our webinar, Ethics, Mental Health, and the Future of Work. We're so glad that you all have decided to join us and spend your afternoon with us here today. This is the second webinar in a series of webinars on ethics and the future of work. We have a great group of panelists lined up for you today, and I'm excited about some of the conversations that we're going to be having. So we're going to go ahead and we will start with a few brief housekeeping remarks. So this is a webinar style Zoom meeting, which means that all of our participants will be kept on mute throughout the duration of the presentation. So with that, we encourage you to use the chat function for any technical issues. In the chat function, you can reach out and members of our team will be answering you in that function, helping out with any technical issues or difficulties that you may be having. If you have a specific topic-related question that you would like to ask our panelists, please use the Q&A box on the control panel of your screen. That way, our panelists will be able to see some of those questions that you're asking, and our moderator can try and incorporate any of those questions into our discussion today. We also are excited to have one of our PhD students, Sarah, in our chat, joining us today to provide a few topics and resources throughout the conversation if we need any additional resources in our talk today. Unfortunately, today we were unable to get closed captioning for the live webinar. However, we will make sure that our captioning is available in our webinar recording. This recording will be available via YouTube to you all, and it will be included in a follow-up email after today's webinar. And then finally, we would love if you will take a minute at the end of our webinar today to take a survey to give us some feedback on this series. We will also be collecting continuing education credit information in that survey. So if you are here to claim any continuing education credit, please make sure you take that survey so that you can get that credit. So without further ado, we will go ahead and get started. I am honored to introduce our moderator, Dr. Daniel Goldberg.
Thanks, Madison. I appreciate it. So hi, everybody. I'm Daniel Goldberg. I am core faculty in the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Colorado's Anschutz Medical Campus, and I have faculty appointments in this, the School of Medicine, in the Department of Family Medicine, and in the Colorado School of Public Health and the Department of Epidemiology. My background is I'm trained as a lawyer, and I am a historian, and I am a bioethicist, and I focus almost exclusively on public and population health issues. Public health law and public health ethics in particular. Those are the areas I do a lot of work on: social determinants of health, both communicable and non-communicable disease, structural violence, health inequalities. That's a lot of my background. So it's my honor to be here and moderate the panel and sort of give our panelists a chance to really sort of share a lot of their views and educate all of us. So I'm going to give very brief introductions of each of our panelists, and then I'll actually transition to them and let them share a little bit of their background as well, because they can do it better than I can. Then they'll also be sharing a little bit. While they do that, they'll also be sharing at least one to 2 points that we share sort of at the top of their mind, right? So sort of just introducing themselves and giving you a little sense of what they're sort of thinking about in relation to the theme of today's panel, of course, which is ethics, mental health, and the future of work, right? So we'll go ahead and get started. I see we have 2 of our panelists who are here with us right now, so we'll start. And we'll start with Alex Yannicone. And Alex, tell me if I'm mispronouncing your last name, because I want to be sure to get that right, okay? So please correct me. Alex is the Director of Education and Community Programs at the Helen and Arthur E. Johnson Depression Center in the CU School of Medicine. And so I'll let Alex sort of take it away from here.
Perfect, thank you. And you did a great job with my last name. It's always a little, people always kind of are thrown off by it. But thank you for the introduction. I am Alex. My primary role is to provide education and programming around mental health to our communities. And we do a lot of work specifically in workplaces in providing that kind of education and resources and support so that workplaces really have a better understanding of what they can do to help their employees and their own mental health, and also with their production and productivity within the company and how those go hand in hand. So I offer a range of education opportunities, anywhere from stress management to topics like suicide prevention. So that's primarily my role and really what I do and my focus. I obviously bring a lot of the mental health aspect. That's my area of expertise when it comes to this. But as we are kind of diving more into how mental health impacts the workplace and vice versa, I think it's really important to understand just a couple things. And one is that this doesn't change overnight. This is a process, this is ongoing. This is something that needs buy-in, needs a lot of people on board to really understand how we can support our employees, support each other, so that we can support the work that we are all doing as well. Also, I think another piece of this is really understanding the value of thinking what we call upstream, or thinking kind of more in the preventative piece. So often we are really reactive to mental health concerns in the workplace. And there's a lot that we can do that's more preventative and really benefits the company as a whole by thinking a little bit more ahead in how we can support our employees and their overall well-being and health in general. So thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alex. And so we'll go to our next panelist, who's Bethany Bogus Alcauter. She is, just to give you a brief introduction, Bethany is the Director of Evaluation and in the National Agricultural Worker Health Program at the National Center for Farm Worker Health. And so I'll let Bethany tell you a little bit more about her background and what she's thinking about in terms of the theme of the panel, especially.
Thank you, Daniel. It's great to be here this afternoon. Our organization is really focused on building capacity of local organizations and local healthcare providers to better serve farm workers, migratory and seasonal farm workers in their areas. And I'm really lucky I get to do a whole bunch of different things in my job: research, evaluation, and I also spend a lot of time talking to farm workers in different parts of the country. So through some of that work, it's been really insightful. And I think when we're talking about mental health issues, one thing that's very simple, but a lot of people forget, is that low wage work, or so-called low skill work, doesn't mean it's low stress. And the other key point I think that's really important to remember is that whether you're talking about research or policy or regulations, we should always be looking for ways to build the agency and the power of workers to create their own solutions, rather than trying to focus on solutions that may fit a broad population. I think workers really know best their own circumstances and what needs to happen to support their own well-being.
Awesome, thanks, Bethany. So we do have a third panelist scheduled who is having some technical difficulties. Hopefully he'll be able to join us. If not, we'll just carry on and maybe I'll start yelling and ranting and raving a bit more in the panel, as I am wont to do. But just to give you a sense of who our third panelist is, if he's able to join us, we'll have him do a more thorough introduction when he joins us. But he's Paul Schulte, and he, until very recently, I think, was the director in the Division of Science Integration in NIOSH, in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So hopefully we will be able to get Paul in to join us. And if not, we'll just carry on and move forward with our questions for the panelists. Okay, so we'll get started with those questions now. I think, as Madison may have mentioned, you're welcome to be typing questions into the Q&A while we go along. Some of those we'll try to answer as we move along. We obviously won't get to all of them. We'll have a more formal sort of period for Q&A after we've sort of gone through some of the set of questions that we've prepared for you all today. So we'll go ahead and start there. And the first question is for both of our panelists, anyone who wants to sort of answer it. But what what we're wondering here is speak to the extent of a causal relationship between labor conditions and work environments on the one hand, and sort of worker whole health or worker mental health, if that's what you'd like to speak to, on the other. To what extent do environmental and structural factors determine worker health? And I know that Alex, in particular, you mentioned something about that already, but that's the theme of the panel. So I want to make sure that both panelists have a chance to really sort of talk about the causal relationship, which is something that a lot of people, of course, are very interested in and is important for policymaking in general. So please tell us what you sort of think about that, or how you work with that in your daily life, or what you think of the evidence, any of those. And I didn't direct that. So I'll start with Alex. Go ahead.
I know it's always like, oh, who should unmute first? So, I come from a very kind of focused on a mental health background, but we do know that when it comes to, the work that anybody really does, there is always going to be an overlap in how their environment and the structure and the relationships that happen. And as Bethany kind of mentioned, the stress or the conditions of a workplace, how that impacts their mental health, and then also how their mental health impacts their ability to do that work as well. We know that physical health and mental health go hand in hand. So the environment, the relationships, the expectations, the workload, all of that is going to impact a person's overall health, their physical and mental health together. So I think that's something that a lot of times has been separated before. And as we are moving forward, especially with what's happened in the last couple of years, I think there's more of a focus in recognizing that there's just, they go hand in hand. And that's something that as employers, we're going to have to shift the way that we really think about this and the way we've addressed it in the past. And to your point, Daniel, kind of thinking about how do we change policies and practices to really understand that a little bit better. Bethany, I don't know if you have anything, you have a unique perspective, so you probably have a lot to add there.
I think about how Daniel's a historian. I also like history, and because of the workers that I work with, a lot of them, I interact with a lot of Indigenous Latin Americans who have recently immigrated here, and they're still undergoing sort of the industrialization transition in some parts of Mexico and Central America. So sort of this really new idea that we have like separate sections of our lives, like we have work, we have recreation, and those being separate, that's a new idea, especially to a lot of people. Whereas before, you were farming, you lived where you worked, you celebrated where you worked, everything happened in the same place. And so I think this idea that they're not related is kind of a new thing of us trying to compartmentalize wage work in our normal lives, when really it's the same thing. Even though we no longer work where we live, it still is so directly connected, and there's just no way to separate it out.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Bethany. And I think, full disclosure for the audience. So I drafted these questions in consultation with the panelists. It wasn't just out of my head. But since I drafted them, principally, I have a sense of what I meant when I was drafting them. And I think part of it is, we have a tendency in our society, in Western and US society in particular, right, to really see sort of health outcomes as largely a function of sort of individual acts and behaviors, right? And so the overwhelming evidence we get from social epidemiology, from occupational health, is that that's not really true, right? That really it's the conditions in which we live, work, and play that have a pronounced impact on health. And so with work and labor conditions in particular, the evidence here is really old. I mean, speaking to Bethany's point as a historian, we have hundreds of years of evidence of the ways in which working conditions exert such an enormous impact on health outcomes. And unfortunately, because a lot of those conditions are structural, they're out of the control of individual workers, right? And especially when we think about marginalized or disempowered populations, which are unfortunately, in the West, traditionally, often people of color, not always, but often women and people of color, right? It's their structural conditions that really, really have such an enormous impact on their whole health and their mental health in particular. And we have so much evidence for that, right? And so I think that's really important. We've also seen this during the pandemic, right? Where, there are workers in certain industries who are less able to really control their environment, right? In ways that really sort of ensure health for themselves and their families and their communities, right? And so that's the focus of this panel in general. And I think the Center for Health, Work, and Environment as well is thinking about those sort of larger structural and labor conditions. And Alex and Bethany are people who literally live and work that every single day. So they see it. And that's partly why we've brought them to you as panelists, right? So moving on to the next question. And this is for anyone. We really hope to have Paul here to help us answer this question because he works for an agency, but that's okay. We can all talk about it. And I am a law expert and a regulation expert, so I can talk about it if I have to, okay? But the question here is, what's the role of regulatory action in policy in creating healthy work environments that can prevent adverse worker mental health and well-being? So what's the connection for our panelists between regulatory action and policy in creating healthy work environments, right? And this time we'll start with Bethany, actually.
This is a really interesting question. And I think it's really tough. I think that there's part of me that based on my experience working with immigrant workers and advocating for them, that really believes in these agencies like the Wage and Hour Division and OSHA and sort of the power they have to create these really necessary baseline regulations for workers that are extremely vulnerable. Like spelling it out that employers have to provide clean drinking water, or that they can't, do human trafficking. I mean, these really basic things, I think, regulations are so important and they need to be enforced. But I think there is a real limit to the regulations and enforcement and what can happen, especially in this country. And so I think I'm hesitant to put too much faith in just that system. I think it's important to have that system that exists for people that are really vulnerable, while we're exerting a lot of energy and making sure that we're creating policies that build worker power, whether that's through unions or other types of organizations for workers, where workers can exercise their voice and they can make decisions and they can do their own enforcement, kind of like a model we see with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, where they have workers really crafting regulations and enforcing them on farms.
So before we go to Alex, I'm going to follow up, Bethany. So, because I think you raise a really important point. What's the nature of the limits that you perceive, right? You said you think there's a limit to how much regulatory action can really do. Why? Where are the limits, and why do they exist where they are in your mind or in your experience?
A really good example is I worked a lot with different local and regional OSHA offices over the last 10 or 15 years. And, when you have a more regulatory heavy presidential administration, like we did under Obama, there was a lot of support for vulnerable workers. We were able to collaborate really easily with OSHA. And then once the administration changed, all of that infrastructure got taken away and there was nothing. So I think because it's so tied to politics, it gets risky, right? That infrastructure can just disappear. And so that's why I think it's important to invest in workers having their own power rather than having it rely on the whims of an administration.
Awesome. Thanks, Bethany. Very helpful. So, Alex, what do you see either in your experience or in your mind? What's the role of regulatory action and policy in creating healthy work environments that can support worker mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bethany brought up, really good points there. I think kind of what she said there at the end of, it is hard when things are so tied to out of the worker's control or their decision making, and yet decisions are being made on their behalf that may not be the best in supporting, what they do or who they are. And so there is kind of that fine line there of how it does support or really help the mental health of the individuals. But I do think ways that we can use it in a positive way when we're creating actions or policy is to gauge the workers themselves and get them involved in what is helpful for you. And that's something that we do a lot. I work a lot within the construction industry. And then I also work in other areas like with banks and schools. And obviously those populations are very, very different. And so the actions and policies that a construction company need are very different than what a school district needs. And so I think, gauging their needs, what they would benefit from, what supports they could really utilize, getting them involved in that is what's going to really help with their overall well-being, and especially when we're talking about mental health. And so I think that's something we have to really, again, to Bethany's point, really see how can we bring the individuals in, or at least have a better understanding of who we're trying to support there.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you both. Really sort of helpful answers. So I'll disclose I do public health law work. And so one of the basics of the field of public health law is that law and policies are major social determinants of health, right? So that the laws and policies and regulations we have, or the ones we don't have, right, are very strongly sort of determinative of health outcomes in given populations. And I think the evidence for this is pretty strong. So I'm probably more bullish on the potential use of laws and policies as a way to support worker health and worker mental health. But Bethany, your point is 100% right. Of course you're right, right? I mean, especially when you're talking about regulations, which for those of you who don't know, in a US structure, those are executive branch based. So as presidential administrations change, or as gubernatorial governors change in the US, right, the resources that are available to given agencies and the agency priorities may also change to some extent, right? Some agency officials are appointees of given executive branches and some aren't. Some are permanent workers and employees. So there's some of that, but that challenge is real. I think part of it, to go to Alex and Bethany, something you were both saying, is I think there's also opportunities to get these worker communities actually involved in policymaking as well, right? And that's probably the best way to do it. Instead of sort of having an agency sort of impose top-down regulations and policies across different industries with different groups of workers and communities, there are models of policymaking where it's sort of trying to build it from the ground up, right? Where you're really sort of engaging the workers themselves from a very early point in the process, including their representatives, Bethany, to your point, right? Maybe we're actually talking to unions, right? Maybe we're talking to trade associations, right? Maybe we're talking to other kinds of self-help organizations, advocacy organizations, right, that are representing that as well, right? So I'm a little bullish, but not because I disagree with either of you. You're absolutely right. There are limits to these kind of things, and it's interesting to kind of figure out how to parse them and get around them, given the nature of health politics in general, right, which is always changing. So I see that from the chat, it looks like we have managed to get Paul. So Paul, welcome. I'm so glad you're able to join us. Would you like to give just a brief introduction of yourself for the audience? Looks like Paul is still muted. Hi, Paul. Okay, we'll move on and we'll see if we can get Paul to introduce himself as we go through the next round of questions. So there are some questions in the Q&A as well. And we'll try to incorporate some of those as we go through sort of the remainder of today's session. So next question is, it's important. I mean, again, I'm sort of biased because this is partly what I do, but I think ethics is important. And I think it's important to think about ethics systematically. So to what extent do you all feel that employers are ethically responsible, not just legally responsible, which of course we can also talk about, but to what extent do you all think employers ethically responsible for creating work conditions that support worker health and worker mental health in particular? So speak to the employer's ethical responsibility for creating these work conditions. And we'll start with Alex this time.
mean, I obviously have some bias here that I think that yes, they are ethically responsible for it. And I think there's a few ways we can look at this. I think one is, they are ethically responsible for creating healthy work environments for the overall well-being of just that person, of another human being, and for that individual. But obviously, we know there are industries and companies that may not be their top priority. Their top priority is their bottom line. It's how are we functioning? What's our productivity? But what research overwhelmingly does show, though, is that if we really create healthy work environments, if we support the mental health of our employees, not only does it help that individual as a person, but it actually also helps our bottom line and our productivity as a whole. And so, I think the kind of return on investment, those kind of pieces that is a lot of people's on the forefront of employers' minds. When we look at this, it is kind of their responsibility, because it does in fact affect the way that their company or their industry functions. So, that's obviously I'm biased in that, but we also see the benefits through when companies do invest in this and really do prioritize it, that there's outcomes that benefit. There's no reason not to, I guess. And so that's kind of where I kind of stand and what I kind of view.
Okay, Bethany?
Yeah, I agree, Alex. I think it's really pretty straightforward. I mean, I used to sell eggs and goat meat, and if someone got sick from eating my eggs or my goat meat, I'm responsible, right, for their health. So same thing, employers are responsible for the health of people who are producing their products or services, just like they're responsible for the health of people consuming their products or services. And just to illustrate the point briefly, in 2020, I did a series of really interesting interviews with ag employers and people in the ag industry from the business owner side. And a lot of them were saying, well, we're having all these outbreaks among our employees, COVID outbreaks, but it's because they live in overcrowded housing. It's not because of the work environment. And I asked them, why do they live in overcrowded housing? And you'd see people pause, right? Because they're being paid such a low wage that they have to live in overcrowded housing. So it goes straight back to the work environment. So I think it's just straightforward.
It's interesting, speaking as both an ethicist and a policy person, right? If the ethical responsibility is straightforward, which I completely agree with you, I think it is straightforward, right? Then there are a lot of gaps, right? I mean, there's a big difference between the ethical responsibilities and how we honor them, right, as individuals and of course as organizations and collectives and employers as well. So it's that gap that I personally find interesting and problematic, and probably not in that order, problematic and then interesting in terms of ways to try to fix these problems. So let's go to a question from the audience, because I think this is an interesting question I'd like to pose to both of you. And Bethany, we'll start with you. But this question is, in a high hazard risk manufacturing environment, employers may be reluctant to hire people who are actually taking antidepressant or anti-anxiolytic drugs, right? So where is the help both for the individuals, the workers, or the applicants, the candidates who are taking these drugs, right? Because we know antidepressants and anti-anxieties as a class are very highly utilized in the US. There's a lot of people who take these, right? So how can we help these workers? How can we help their employers, right? And encourage them and sort of incentivize them to hire persons who live with depression and anxiety and who may be taking these kinds of medications as treatment in these high hazard risk manufacturing environments?
This is such a good question, and this comes up a lot with opiate dependence too. Like, especially, I used to do a lot of work with construction workers, and there's so many you have work-related injury and then you get hooked on painkillers, and it gets really tricky because same with depression, like the two things are kind of linked. So how much responsibility does the employer have especially if the issue started with the job, or even if it didn't. I think, I don't know if I have a good solution to that. I think it is a really sticky issue and one we'll have to increasingly figure out, how to help people heal, but also provide a safe work environment for them. I really don't have a good solution on this. I don't know if Alex or Daniel have a good idea.
I mean, I agree. It is tricky. I think the problem is we want an answer that can apply to the masses, and that when it comes to mental health and this topic of prescription use and how it affects individuals, it's so unique to the person. Where somebody who is dependent on an antidepressant, and that helps them function, and when they're off of it, they're actually in a higher hazard risk and really is more of a detriment, where it could be vice versa. So it is a tricky question. I think one of the things that we can do that can help with this is, and obviously this is coming from the person who does this, but education is really important, because there is so much misunderstanding and miscommunication around substances, whether it's prescriptions, around anxiety and depression prescriptions or opioids or whatever it may be, and kind of the trickiness behind that. The more we can have education within the workplace around this, I think we're going to make better decisions that really support our employers. But so much of the decisions that are made from misinformation or misguidance, or a one-off story that something went bad and that now we're applying to everybody. And that's just not a realistic way to address this concern.
Yeah, those are both terrific points. And just picking up on, I think, something that both of you said. So I study stigma. That's probably my central area of sort of work day in and day out. And so I'd say, sort of one thing is, our risk perceptions are obviously subjective and are really affected by a lot of different factors. One of the things we know is that stigma and stigmatizing views about marginalized groups in particular have an enormous influence on our risk perception, right? We think that certain groups of people are risky precisely because we stigmatize those groups, right? And that's what sort of how stigma operates in our society. So I think one question to ask right at the beginning, and Alex, I think you were sort of getting to this, right, a little bit when you were sort of answering a little bit, is to what extent are persons who are taking these kinds of drugs, right, antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs, or any other kinds of interventions, medications that they're taking for any kind of mental health conditions that they have, to what extent does that really pose a significant safety risk for themselves and their coworkers in these environments, versus to what extent do we believe that they do because we stigmatize persons who take these kinds of interventions, right? You can probably guess, I think it's a lot more the latter than the former, which doesn't mean there aren't real safety concerns for some kinds of people taking some kinds of drugs with some kinds of health problems. But even for that group of people, which I think is much smaller than we think it is, that's my view, right? You don't have to agree with me, but that's my view. I think it's a much smaller population who are at risk, right? Or who could potentially expose their coworkers, right, to risks. Even for those groups, that's where disability law comes in, I think, right? Workers and employers are both, I think, legally and morally obligated, to take steps to accommodate workers with health conditions and impairments, right? And to create environments by accommodating them in which they can perform the essential functions of their job safely. Right. And so they can continue to work with the application of certain kinds of accommodations in ways that are safe for them and safe for their coworkers. Right. And I think that my personal view is we have a long way to go before we've adequately addressed the role of stigma in sort of affecting our risk perceptions of workers, and an even probably longer way to go in really sort of effectively integrating disability requirements and accommodations for these kinds of workers as well, right? So it is a real issue. It's not to disagree. It is a real issue, but I think there's a lot we can do to help workers and employers in these situations as well. I think we have more agency in these contexts than we think, right? So Bethany or Alex, is there anything you want to say in response to what I just said, or no?
I mean, I would 100% agree kind of what you mentioned there. I also think when you talk about stigma, obviously that's a huge concern within the workplace. And when we are making this like if somebody, let's say, is dependent on antidepressants and they don't feel safe in their workplace disclosing or having the ability to disclose that information to supervisors, we're creating a further stigma that then puts them at further risk for mental health concerns or issues as well. So by not having conversations about this, by not really thinking about how do we protect our employees, and if they're off that antidepressant, what does that mean for the workplace as well? And so again, it's complex, it's not easy, but I do think that when you bring up that stigma piece, that's a huge concern. And right now, how we address stigma a lot of times is just by ignoring it. We just kind of don't talk about it. We push it aside. And obviously that further stigmatizes those individuals who really could use that open communication and resources to really be able to guide their overall health.
Okay, great. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. We'll move on to some more questions here as we sort of go through. So both of you work with, and in particular, Bethany, you work with some specific kinds of workers in particular, right? So in particular industries. So I was just wondering if the panelists could speak to the specific challenges faced by some, and here's the phrase, sort of multiply marginalized workers, right? Workers who experience multiple kinds of disadvantages, right? It could be economic disadvantage. They could be exposed to racism and discrimination more than other kinds of communities, but multiply marginalized workers in food industries in particular, right? Because that's one of the things we've seen, for example, unfolding in the COVID-19 pandemic is that, so for example, meat packing workers or migrant and seasonal farm workers, and Bethany, of course, we want to hear what you have to say about these communities in particular. What are some specific challenges that these workers face? And then how can we sort of assist them, right? What does a commitment to justice demand of us with regard to workers and their families in the food industries in particular? So we'll go ahead and start with Bethany with this one.
Yeah, I had thought of two really concrete examples in case you all haven't caught on, I think, very concretely. One is this issue that I interact with a lot of H-2A visa guest workers, and these are workers who, most of them come from Mexico, most of them are young men in their 20s and 30s, and they're brought here on a temporary basis to work on farms for like 10 or 11 months out of the year. And the bulk of those workers that I've interacted with work about 100 hours a week, which is an insane amount of time. They work 7 days a week, 16 hours a day. And what I've seen from workers and from employers with that kind of work week is that they want the money. They want to be able to earn the money. They don't make any overtime, so they'll take as many hours as they can get. And it's, I think that issue really speaks to these different kinds of marginalization and disempowerment that happens because workers are coming from such poor areas in a poor country that this might be their only chance to make money for years. And so the employers are really, in a sense, exploiting that need and overworking people. And recently, actually, quite sadly, I've stayed in contact with one of these workers who was working on this visa doing milk trucking all over the Midwest. And one of his colleagues just died in an accident, maybe because of these crazy work hours. So that to me is a really clear example. And then the second example that's really different that I've seen for folks who experience different kinds of vulnerabilities is recently I was on a field of a really large produce company that has most of their farms located on the Texas-Mexico border. And I went to a field, there was about 80 workers weeding this field. And I noticed that about 2/3 of the workers were standing up and they were using a tool to weed that had a long handle so that they could stand up. And then about 1/3 of the workers were crouching over on their hands and knees using a small hand tool to weed. And they're all weeding the same weeds. And so we started talking to the workers, and then I realized all the people on their hands and knees were folks who spoke an indigenous language. And all the folks who were standing up were Spanish-speaking individuals. So these kinds of things, these structural kinds of issues can take place in really simple but really obvious ways. And it's really concerning for the toll that it takes physically and mentally on these workers.
Awesome, thanks, Bethany. So Alex, any thoughts on, again, the particular challenges faced by workers in food industries in particular, and then what we can do to sort of help them and their families and their communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bethany's example there was really interesting because there's not and I feel like this has been my answer for everything, but there's not a perfect answer to anything, because when they're put into these situations where their driving force is to make money to help their families, and the only way to do that is to work these insane hours, it's really difficult to say, okay, well, let's support their mental health by providing these additional services or these things, when that, their basic needs are at their forefront. So there does need to be a shift where there's, and from an employer stance and from a systematic and policy, that obviously is an incredibly unhealthy environment, and that needs to change first, before we can really do all this other work that we want to do. Because driving forces for all of us is always going to start with our basic needs, and then everything else kind of comes into play. I do a lot of work around suicide prevention. And not surprisingly, these industries like, mining and construction and agriculture, they all have the highest rates of suicide. And understandably so, exactly with Bethany's example of like the stress, the hours, the work, the actual workload, and what that toll takes on an individual physically and mentally, is concerning. And so I think, this is something that needs to be addressed at a level of the overall well-being of the individual, and they're getting their basic needs met at a reasonable conditions. And then we can do other things to help support them, but that's got to be addressed first.
Hello, Daniel.
Hey, Paul, do we have you?
I think so. I apologize to everyone. We're having a lot of rain here in Cincinnati, and I don't know if that affected my system or not, but I'm on by phone.
Well, that's terrific. Paul, would you like to just briefly introduce yourself for the audience?
Sure. I'm Paul Schulte. Formerly, I was the director of the Division of Science Integration at NIOSH and the co-coordinator of the Nanotechnology Research Center. I'm an epidemiologist by training, and I've been doing a lot of work in the last few years on the concept of well-being in occupational safety and health and its utility and ways to operationalize it.
Well, fantastic, Paul. We're so glad you were able to join us. Maybe a little break in the rain. And as long as you don't float away in the next 45 minutes or so, right, we'll have you for the rest of the time. So that's terrific. So we'll go ahead and answer a question, I think, from the Q&A, because I think this is a really interesting and important question. So, and Paul, we'll start with you as an answer to this question. Are there discussions around designing workload and work expectations to be proportional to the capabilities of the employees? So almost sort of like a built environment kind of question, right? Are there discussions around designing workload and work expectations to be proportional to the capabilities of employees? And we'll start with Paul.
Well, I think that, first of all, backing up a bit, we have to realize that, or it's been realized that issue, the capabilities of workers and the fit of their capabilities to work, has a history, and that history is something we can build on. So indeed, yes, there are discussions in the world of work about better fitting of employees and work. The fact that there are discussions, though, may not be sufficient, that there needs to be action. And so that discussion has to be crystallized and then built into policies, possibly even regulations that would better allow for employees to do their jobs. We're seeing now that we have a mismatch in the work environment and the needs of workers. We see all the things that have been talked about here, as well as burnout, obfuscation of work-life balance, the 24/7 kind of activities. So we see that we have to move on that. There are some ways to do that have been considered. For example, the International Standards Organization, ISO, has developed a standard 45003 on occupational safety and health management and psychosocial health issues. We need standards like that. We need the standards like the activities that are going on in Canada to tee up for employers the concepts that we're talking about, and then give them some guidance in how best to achieve them. So I think that while there is discussion, there's a need for more discussion, also and action. And also, while there is discussion, there's a need for more research on the factors that affect the fit of employees and the activities of managers. This kind of discussion usually devolves to thinking about the worker as the pivot point of activity, when in fact it's the employer who manages the work environment who needs to make effective changes and important changes. Now, this becomes problematic when you have workers in gig kind of situations where it's not clear who's the employer. It's actually one party selling something to another party, and the efforts to apply the employer responsibility in those situations has been difficult, and so we need work on that. So I'll stop there for a second to see if you want to interject or move on.
Absolutely, Paul. That's super helpful. Why don't we see what our other panelists have to say, sort of bounce back some ideas, and then we can come back to you if you have some sort of additional thoughts on this. But again, just sort of the theme here is, to what extent do we need to have discussions or actions, to Paul's point, right, about a better fit between workload and work expectations and employee, actually worker capabilities? And we'll go to Bethany.
I mean, unfortunately, in agriculture, I have not heard much about that, but it would be fantastic to think about that.
Okay, so maybe an ethical responsibility that we're pretty far away from implementing, perhaps, Bethany, right? At least in agriculture, right? And then for farm workers. Alex, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does need to be happening, right? There needs to be more discussions, and I think they're actually, besides Bethany's, in agriculture, and I'm sure there's a lot of other industries that are really struggling with this as well. But overall, I do think this is something the pandemic did bring up a little bit more in conversations, which has been good, where people are able to have more conversations of what can be done and what people can do in different environments and with different time and different in different, I guess, different time frames, right? So that idea of 9 to 5 or 9 to 6, and you have to be in an office and you have to be doing this, that's changed in a lot of different environments. And I think we recognize that people can get work done in different ways. Obviously in things like agriculture, construction, or, you know, industries where there's not as much flexibility, there's still, you know, still some issues there. But I think this conversation is going to continue and really grow based off of what we've experienced these last 2 years.
Daniel, if I could interject.
Please, Paul, by all means.
Two thoughts here. One is that I think we need to stratify our discussion and thinking a bit in terms of two types of workforces: the deskless workforce and those who can work from home on their desks. Too often, a lot of this discussion has been around the people working from home, and it doesn't pertain directly to the people who have to be out on the front lines, the deskless workers. Clearly, they suffer the same exposures to these kind of hazards, but maybe in a different way. And in both cases, and so we need to have the discussion be clear in for both of those types of workers. Secondly, a overarching consideration in this is the autonomy of the workers and the opportunity of the workers to have a say in the conditions of their work. And indeed, this is where I think it's incumbent upon the occupational safety and health community to provide data and information for workers and their representatives, and to be advocates for workers in making and achieving this kind of autonomy, so that they can have a role in determining the conditions of work. And then some of these mismatch issues can be directly addressed with that kind of determination.
That's terrific, Paul. Thanks so much. I'm so glad we got you on the panel, right? So we'll go ahead and keep going. We do have some more questions from the audience in particular. So here with this question, we will start with Alex with this question. What are some examples of successful worker mental health policies? If you can't think of any, that's also okay. That tells us something. Negative results count, right? So
yeah, I mean, I would say there is not a lot out there around this. You know, this is, I do think this will become more of a norm, but right now there is not a lot of policy regarding, you know, mental health specifically around this. With that though, there are things that kind of go into that where we look at, you know, what kind of benefits do they maybe have access to that would support their mental health? What kind of policies do they have with their supervisors in having discussions like open door policies or expectations and responsibilities of employers or flexible return to work policies after a mental health crisis. So there are things that can be integrated, but as terms of like here's a perfectly packaged policy that can apply to everybody. One, we're never going to have exactly that, but we also know that this is newer. I think this is starting to become of topic and starting to look at and say, we do need something around this. And this is becoming a lot more of a topic just in my work, where I'm having a lot of workplaces reach out to me and like, you know, HR especially is just taking on a lot right now when it comes to their employers' health. And they're like, you know, I am not a therapist, I am not a mental health expert, and I am being flooded with all these concerns. And this is where I really think policies could be really helpful to support the employees, but also the overall structure of what's going on, because we are seeing people's mental health really being, you know, tested right now. And that's going to continue as we are talking more about this. And so I think we need to think about policies for each industry, for each company specifically, start small and try to build from there. But it's going to be a lot of kind of trial and error, I think, as well as we start to do this.
Thanks, Alex. And just to your last point, I'm not sure if anybody watches it, but there's quite a humorous show called Mythic Quest on Apple Plus TV, which is a show written and produced by Rob McElhenney. And in that show, there's actually an ongoing theme, Alex, to your exact point, where the director of human resources is one of the characters in the show, and she's played brilliantly. And she is basically dealing with literally everybody, all the workers, half of the workers basically regarding her as a therapist, and she wants to help, but it becomes funny. But I was watching it and thinking, to your point, Alex, geez, I wonder how much this is really going on, right? Like, it's funny, it's a satire, but satires are actually making, the point of satires is that these are things that are really happening actually, right? And so that's the moment that we're in. And I think it's even reflected in this kind of sort of popular culture, even in sort of a absurdist comedy like that show, right? So it's real. Bethany, examples of successful worker mental health policies that you're aware of, if there are any.
Well, I think this goes to Alex's point that there may not necessarily be a whole lot of policies for vulnerable workers specifically about their mental health, but I have seen policies that have a huge impact on workers' mental health by changing the structure of the work environment. So, for example, a lot of my work has been around heat safety and access to drinking water. And one thing I heard over and over again from workers that couldn't access drinking water at the worksite was that they were treated worse than dogs, was the phrase that everybody would use. And so not having access to that basic thing, they knew they could bring water, but the fact that their employer wouldn't provide it for them made them feel some kind of way, like it really hurt. And it felt like a basic human right. So I've seen employers on the flip side who make a huge effort to do these things and go above and beyond, like providing shade on the work site, providing Gatorade and cold water, providing camel packs for farm workers to wear and things like that so they can drink water throughout the day. Or with employers who bring in workers and have to provide housing, providing nice housing rather than really low quality housing has a huge impact on the mental and physical well-being of workers. So I think, at least for a lot of vulnerable workers in those kinds of industries, that we can start honestly with pretty basic stuff, and it would have a huge benefit to the workers' mental health.
Yeah, and just to that point, Bethany, I mean, one of the things that sort of struck me when you were talking about is, although of course we do want our policies and our actions with regard to worker health, right, to connect to mental health and well-being in particular, but we also don't want to draw sort of false distinctions between sort of mental and physical well-being, to your point, right? And in an overwhelming, the majority of cases and actions that we could think of, especially with policies, right, the things that are going to support whole health for workers are going to support mental health and well-being for those workers as well, right? And so, we don't want to we do want to draw attention to mental and behavioral health for workers, because these are areas in our society in general, even beyond workers and labor, that have traditionally been underfunded, paid little attention to, and stigmatized in some important ways. I think, Bethany, your point is also really important, that, we really want to focus on policies that are just good for worker health in general. And those are also likely to be good for worker mental health and well-being in general, right? It sort of connects that way. So I'm not sure, I saw Paul may have dropped off. Paul, are you still with us?
I'm there. Can you hear me?
We got you. No problem. So examples of successful worker mental health policies that you can think of, or if you can't think of any, that's fine. You can speak to that as well.
Well, first of all, before we even talk about policies, we might talk about foundational approaches that are going to lead to policies. I mean, clearly, I think the point has been made that there aren't a lot of policies that deal with workers' mental health and psychosocial hazards. And in fact, we know that there's not parity in insurance coverage or compensation coverage between physical health problems and mental health problems. But what we're seeing, the great realization that these are the problems of the present and are going to burgeon in the future. So we need to so the foundations that move toward this are such things as like the WHO's workplace framework and model, which starts to think about a broader view of worker health. The NIOSH Total Worker Health Program is another example, and the ILO's decent work program is another. These are foundational, and they set the stage then for research and policy to be developed. Now, some of the policies that are in play now that might be worth looking at for people is the one I mentioned, the ISO 45003 is a very thoughtful effort. And it's been adopted in the U.S. by the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI. So we have something like that to look to as possibly a building block. The Canadians are doing a marvelous job. Mental health in the workplace. Ontario mental health in the workplace effort in that province is good, and then there's an overarching Canadian document, I believe, on as a policy. There's a paper that just was released in 2019, was published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health by Shiriko and colleagues on psychosocial risk prevention in a global occupational health perspective. And they went through the ILO database on occupational safety and health legislation. And they've searched for legislation that relates to psychosocial risks and problems of that nature. So I would say that would be a good way for us to really make an inventory. I think we're a little bit, and I'm guilty of it too, of saying there's not much out there when there actually are starting to be more. Clearly not enough, and clearly not. It's not internalized in the corporate management structure as something that needs to be followed, but it's indeed we're starting to see it. So I would say the ISO and the Canadian efforts would be two models that I would point people to.
And Paul, I really appreciate, and Bethany, you've been telling us this as well. A lot of times I'm guilty of sort of just focusing overwhelmingly on the US in particular, right? And we are US based, so to some extent that's okay, but it's also important to consider, what's going on globally, especially if you're thinking about sort of social and structural determinants of health. They have to do with the way societies are organized, right? And different societies are actually organized in different ways, and they structure their labor and working environments in different ways too. So it's really important to sort of expand that out and see what we can learn from others who are doing it differently, and in many cases better, right? So I think that that's really helpful and important. We'll take another question from the audience here, and we'll start with Bethany for this one. So how do you change employers to think about mental health and well-being as an improvement to their bottom line? Many employers think that their bottom line is not affected at all by workers because they think workers are sort of a dime a dozen, that they're almost fungible commodities in this way, right? So how do you change or charge employers to thinking about mental health well-being as an improvement to their own business?
That's a tough one. I do think, I don't know where this audience member is located. I do think that the labor shortages we're experiencing in the US is going to have a big impact on that. And that in many industries, there aren't enough workers. And so they do have to pay better. They have to treat their workers better. And so I think that will have a big impact what we're experiencing right now. The other thing I think with vulnerable workers, and it's tricky for ag, because ag in the US, you're lucky to have a 1% profit margin. So there's not a lot of extra resources to work with. But I do think that employers that have managed to do a good job of supporting their employees' well-being and do it while making a profit, sort of exemplifying those and providing replicable steps for other businesses to do the same thing, I think is really helpful. So testimonials basically as to why it works.
Awesome, thanks, Bethany. Paul, would you like to go next? And how do you charge or change employers to think about mental health and well-being as an improvement to their actual bottom line, or get them to stop thinking about workers as sort of commodities, as expendable commodities?
Well, I agree with what Bethany said. as a start. And again, I think it goes back to it's important for us to stratify this discussion in terms of the deskless and the non-deskless workers. Clearly, what she said, what Bethany said about farm workers is right on target, and indeed, getting employers of farm workers to think about their mental health issues is going to be a far distance that we're going to have to go in some ways. But I think the other point that Bethany made is this is a time, this might be the moment when the occupational safety and health and the labor communities can get together and utilize the leverage that is seen in the labor market to demand the kinds of things that workers need in jobs, and this might be the one way to do it. The other thing too is that there is a growing literature on the impact of ill-being on productivity. And that's at the individual, at the enterprise, and at the national level. And we need more research like this, because it's clear from what research is out there that ill-being in workers has a great impact on productivity. And so that kind of business argument can be made to help motivate employers. At the end of the day, it may not be that it's only going to be the business argument that's going to be needed. There's also going to be needed the ethical arguments. But when they're put together, I think they make a formidable tool that can be used to move employers in this direction.
Paul, I just want to say I think that's really important point, because one of the things I think a lot about as an ethicist, and I'm also a policy person, right, is the business case can actually help move and change policy. And so I'm a pragmatist and I like that, but I'm also an ethicist. And I think that even if it didn't improve the bottom line, we have moral obligations, right, to support worker mental health and worker whole health and well-being, even if it costs people money, I would say, right, in a variety of ways. And so I think, putting them together is powerful and important, right? Like either by themselves, either the ethical argument may be compelling, but it may not actually move change as much as the business case, right? But the business case argument without the sort of ethical compass, right, sometimes can flounder, right? Because it isn't always beneficial to the bottom line to integrate policies that support workers' sort of health and well-being. It is often, but it isn't always, right?
Right.
So
exactly.
So Alex, your perspective on this.
Yeah. So obviously, I'm just piggybacking on what everybody already said, because I agree with everything. I think from our perspective, what we see is to use what Paul was even saying of the research that is there to educate employers on what we know. And I can send after this, we have a whole series on workplace suicide prevention, and our whole first chapter of that program is to really set the tone of why is this important to talk about in a workplace. And it is because we do know that it does affect not only the ethical piece of looking out for our employees, but also that piece of it does affect their bottom line. When we take care of our employees, when we look out for each other, when we support each other and have resources, our employees are going to show up and be able to be healthy and productive workers for us. And so the other kind of piece that we're hearing or heard a lot kind of in the last couple of years even is more of this idea of presenteeism, where people are just showing up to work because they have to, but because of their mental health and the way that they, what they're dealing with, they're not actually getting any work done because they're so stressed out, burnt out, overwhelmed, whatever it may be, but they're physically there. And so it looks like, hey, they're doing something, but nothing's actually, the productivity, the bottom line is not being met. So I think the more that employers can recognize that and have the research, the education, then we're going to start to see shift. And again, I come from an education piece, so I think education's always the best starting point. And then they can see like, oh, there's research that really does show this. How can I start implementing this as well?
Absolutely great. Well, I'm just keeping an eye on time and we're starting to get sort of towards the end of our time here. So part of the theme of our session is thinking about the future of work. And so I'd like us to do a little bit of sort of future casting or vision casting, if you will, with this question. This may be our last question. It may not be. But historically speaking, and here I can speak as a historian here, right? There's no question at all that pandemic disease tends to fundamentally reshape the societies in which they have unfolded, right? That there's sort of no going back, right? That everything, well, not everything, but that the societies themselves are going to go through sort of pronounced change. And so in that sort of vein, in your vision for the future of work, what are some of the factors that you anticipate sort of really driving changes in worker health going forward, in worker mental health, if you'd like to speak to that specifically? So in your vision for the future of work, what are the factors that you anticipate sort of being most responsible for driving changes in worker health and worker well-being? And we'll start with Alex for this one.
Oh, man, I wasn't ready for this one. I'm gonna give me a second to think about it, because I feel like this is a
No problem. We'll switch. No, it's no problem. We'll come back to you. Bethany, do you have some things you would like to share and sort of your vision for the future of work?
I think that in all countries we'll keep seeing, climate change and immigration policy play a big role in what the labor force looks like and sort of the risk factors for different workers that go on. But looking at the future, I think sometimes it's easy to get caught up in thinking about like how mechanization or how AI will change work. But really, a lot of times I think that to look forward, we only have to look back. I mean, we're still dealing with a lot of really ancient problems. We're still dealing with racism and poverty, and like guys still get crushed in collapsed trenches. Like we still have a lot of really old problems that we're dealing with, and we'll keep dealing with them until we can really root them out.
Bethany, I have a colleague who's an organizer, and one of his sort of mottos is that he's fighting to cleanse the world of ancient evils. That's what he says. He does. I was like, oh, interesting, right? So Paul, sort of your ideas here in your vision for the future of work. What do you anticipate being the factors that are really going to drive changes in worker health outcomes going forward?
Well, before I get right to that, just to pick up on what Bethany said, it was right on the mark. As we talk about the future of work, we have to realize that we're going to see many of the old hazards still stay around. And so we need to not get so caught up in high-tech thinking that we don't realize that we still have to deal with lead and falls and things of that nature. Also, we're going to see old hazards in new settings that may surprise us, and so we need to be ready for that. But with regard to the future of work, we did a study of looked at 20 years of the literature and looked for future of work scenarios and analyzed them, and we found essentially that the hazards in the future that most people developing scenarios were thinking of were the psychosocial hazards. So indeed, this whole webinar is right on point in that regard. The things that are going to drive some of these hazards and the future of work, one is going to be the lack of skills in workers, or the absence of the appropriate skills in workers. And this is an area that may not be directly, I'm not talking about safety and health skills of protecting themselves. I'm talking about skills to do a particular job. this may be an area that the occupational safety and health community has to expand its focus on. In fact, we've just had an international conference on that and are continuing to work on the idea of the occupational safety and health field taking an expanded focus about the world of work due to all these changes. And what's going to be needed in that is more systems thinking by people in the profession, and a broader transdisciplinary approach where there's more interface and interaction with different disciplines to address things like the lack of skills, or a lot of the equity issues. Or one of the things that's going to really drive the future of work, I think, is the evolution, some may say disintegration, or at least dilution of the social contract. And we're seeing that as a result of the pandemic, and we're seeing that we're just seeing that with gig work in general, the diminution of the employer-employee relationship and the failure of employers who are buying services from people to have any input into the responsibility for safe and healthy conditions. So this is something that really needs to be shored up. The social contract is the implicit relationship and arrangements that we have in society, and expectations. And if those change clearly, and to the point where the responsibilities of employers and of society for the welfare of workers aren't supported, that's going to cause more problems in the future. And then finally, I just might point out that in this 20 years of literature that we looked at to look for scenarios on the future of work, hardly any mention was made of pandemics. This was before it ended with the literature in 2019. So this was before the pandemic, and so it seems now, in retrospect, very short-sighted that wasn't there. But pandemics. Now, this pandemic will accelerate some of these future trends, and the likelihood of other pandemics, I think, is greater. This is going to need to be taken into consideration when we think about new scenarios for the future of work. So those are the drivers that I see right now.
Thanks, Paul. And so we've now given Alex a chance to sort of think about this a little bit. So we'll come back to her and get her view on the factors that are really going to sort of drive worker health and mental health in the future of work.
Yeah, I think I was just kind of, as everybody was talking, thinking about kind of what's happened in my work in the last 2 years. And it has been pretty incredible to see how employers are just now kind of thinking like, oh, my employees' mental health is important, or is something I should be thinking of, or something I should be addressing. And so I think that's something that, as we look to the future, that is going to be kind of more of a norm. Obviously, there's still a lot of complex issues like Bethany and Paul were talking about, but I think as a whole, the looking out for each other, the caring about your mental health, your employees' mental health, creating policy and benefits and support and resources for our employees, that is now on a high topic for a lot of employers. And so I think that's really going to continue. And my hope is that it almost is this driving force that if we're not doing a good job at that you're more you're held accountable for that. And there, you see it more and more in media and news. There's really these highlights of these companies who are really prioritizing their employers and doing things that are beneficial to them as we've navigated this pandemic. And I think that's kind of where we're going to continue to see some hope and some benefit for our employees and the work that they do.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. Okay, well, we are running rapidly towards the end of our time today. So we're going to go ahead and close the panel by asking each panelist, and Bethany, we'll start with you, for sort of your final one take-home message, or what would you like the audience to go home with in terms of one, or they may be at home already these days, right? But what would you like them to sort of take one major take-home message?
That's a tough one. I think given the audience, I think, it's just so important, like a theme that we've talked about throughout, all the panelists have talked about, and that's making sure that your work and the work that you do is really sort of grounded along with the workers that you are trying to serve or trying to help, and making sure that, that you're implementing these things we're talking about, right? Like workers having some decision-making power and agency and things like that. That should all transfer to research or evaluation and all of that. So I think that's just a really critical point to remember.
Awesome. Okay, Paul, we'll go to you. One major take-home message for the audience.
The problems of the future workers and the future of work are going to continue to be multifactorial, and they're going to involve factors that involve the interaction of work hazards with other hazards, personal risk factors, socioeconomic factors. So we need to be thinking in broader terms, and we've been promoting the concept of well-being as a construct that might be useful as an overarching way to capture a lot of these kinds of factors. And NIOSH has developed a survey instrument called the WellBeQ. You can see it on the NIOSH website. That's available to be used by employers and workers to assess well-being in their organizations. I think if we think about the well-being of the workforce, we will address a lot of these kinds of mental health questions, and we will set the stage for the kind of interventions that will help us deal with them.
Awesome, thank you, Paul. And Alex, you will be our final sort of final message from the panel for today, right? So one major take-home message.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we talked about today is kind of big and systemic, and feels a little bit out of our own control. But I think one important thing here is, no matter what work you're in, what you do, be an advocate. Really put, if this is of importance to you, if this is something that you're passionate about, it's not going to change overnight, but keep advocating for yourself, for your work, for your employees, your employers, whatever it may be. Because the more that we are talking about this, the more that we are engaged in this, that's where we're really going to see shift and change. And I think it can get difficult, can feel disheartening at times, but if we all kind of keep going at it, I think we will see, a really, healthy and bright future for our overall workforce.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I would just like to thank all the panelists. I don't have my reaction button in the webinar format on Zoom, but I will thank everybody. Bethany, Alex, Paul, we're so glad you were able to join us, Paul, and I hope the rain stops soon for you in where you're located. So thanks, everyone. This has been a terrific panel. I will turn this back over to Madison to close and send us off.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you again to our panelists for your flexibility and your thoughtfulness today. I think this was a wonderful discussion. Thank you, to all of our attendees too, for your active comments and questions in the chat. But thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.